All right, diving in today, getting into something pretty fundamental. And this one comes straight from you, our listeners. It's a topic that's, well, it's kind of revolutionized the way we think about evolution.
Yeah, it really has.
And that is, of course, the selfish gene. So we're going to be looking at, mainly Richard Dawkins' work on this. That's the core source material for this deep dive.
Yeah, the selfish gene, I mean, even just the title, right off the bat, it's like, whoa, what's going on here?
It definitely grabs your attention.
It does. I mean, even, the publisher Tom Maschler, he actually suggested the immortal gene at some point, maybe a little nod to Oscar Wilde's The Selfish Giant,
Oh, interesting.
But Dawkins, he was really adamant that it wasn't about selfishness in terms of the individual. It was about focusing on the gene itself.
The gene is the key player here.
Exactly. That's that real subtle but crucial distinction, in this whole thing.
Yeah, because what we're really trying to get at is like the core of, the unit of selection.
Right.
In Darwinism,
Yeah.
It's like, what is actually being selected for? And this was, it wasn't just some academic debate. There was a real need to kind of get past these, good of the species kind of arguments.
Oh, yeah.
Where, it seemed like everyone was saying, oh, animals just do things for the good of their species, like some kind of group altruism.
Right. That was kind of like the prevailing idea.
Yeah, but it didn't really hold up.
No, it didn't have that real solid like genetic basis to it, And Dawkins, he really kind of forced everyone to rethink that whole thing.
Yeah, to look at it on a deeper level.
Yeah, and it's really important, when we're talking about altruism and selfishness in this context. We're talking about the behavior.
Right, the actions, not the feelings behind it.
Exactly. Is a behavior going to help you survive or reproduce, or is it going to hurt your chances?
So, just to be super clear, when we say selfish gene, we're not saying genes have feelings or intentions, right?
No, not at all. It's really just about the outcome. Like, does it help the individual doing it? Or does it help someone else, maybe at their own expense? That's what we mean by selfish or altruistic.
Got it. So it's like the gene doesn't care about feelings. It's all about getting copied, replicating itself.
Exactly. It's just playing the numbers game in a way.
Okay. So that brings us to this question of like, what is it that's actually being selected?
Yeah.
Because it's not necessarily the species, right? And it's not even necessarily the individual organism.
Right. It's deeper than that. Well, selection is obviously working on individuals. The gene-centric view, what it's saying is that the gene, that's the real beneficiary of this whole process.
The gene is the winner in the evolutionary lottery.
In a way, yeah. It's the gene that gets passed on, that gets copied across generations, and it has like these properties that make it like the perfect candidate for this role in evolution.
So it's like genes are the ones that are really enduring. They're the ones that have that potential to last for really long time.
Exactly, yeah. So, when we talk about a gene in this context, we're not talking about like a specific functional unit, but more like any chunk of chromosome that has those properties.
Okay, so let's break those down again. What are those properties that make the gene such a prime player?
Okay, so longevity, that's one. The ability to stick around for generations and generations.
To outlast the individual, basically.
Yeah. Then there's fecundity. That's about making lots of copies, spreading those genes far and wide.
Got it.
And the last one, that's copying fidelity. Basically, how accurate are those copies? The more accurate, the better, for the gene's success.
It's like a successful meme, right?
That's actually a great analogy. We'll get into memes a little later.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. But back to genes. A segment of DNA that really fits those criteria, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. And while individual genes, they're not immune to change. They can mutate. They can get broken up through, crossing over and things like that. But that potential for being almost immortal through replication, that's what really makes them like the stars of the show.
They're the ones that are playing the long game, the really, really long game.
Exactly. And a lot of new genetic variations, they don't make it. They don't get passed on.
Are not fit enough.
Right. But the ones that do succeed, they're the ones that through their influence on the organisms that carry them, they actually manage to enhance their own chances of being replicated.
So they're helping themselves by helping the organism survive.
Yeah, in a way, and that's how they achieve that, by influencing the development of what Dawkins called survival machines.
And by survival machines, we mean bodies, right?
Exactly. Our bodies, they're just these intricate, like,
Built
vehicles.
by the genes.
Yeah, built and programmed by genes. And it's all to ensure that the genes can continue their journey, so to speak.
So our bodies are just temporary housing for these long-lived genes.
In a sense, yeah.
And what are the main instructions in this programming?
Well, from the gene's perspective, it's all about survival, right? And reproduction.
Makes sense?
Yeah, that's the ultimate goal. To survive and make more copies of yourself. And all the genes in an organism, they're all working together towards these shared goals.
Even though they're ultimately looking out for their own replication.
Right. That's the interesting part of it. And, these programs that the genes create, they can be amazingly complex. Like, just think about, human consciousness.
That's a whole other level of complexity.
It is. Dawkins compares it to, like, biological computers. And
Right.
even a single neuron, one of those brain cells, it's just vastly more complex than, like, a transistor in a computer.
Wow, so our brains are just like incredibly sophisticated computers.
Yeah, with billions of these neurons all interconnected, it's really mind-blowing. And it's all built under the guidance of the genetic program.
It's amazing to think about.
Yeah.
But these biological machines, they don't necessarily operate with like conscious intent.
Right, not in the way that we normally think about it. A plant, it doesn't think, oh, I need sunlight, I need water. It just grows towards the light and absorbs water.
Right, it just reacts to its environment.
Exactly. So, from a biological perspective, the goals of these machines, they're more like stable states.
Like a balance that they're trying to maintain.
Yeah, exactly. Like, think about a thermostat. It's designed to keep the temperature at a certain level. It doesn't need to be conscious to do that.
It just has a set point.
Right. And then you have more complex systems like, a guided missile. It uses feedback to lock on to a target.
So it's goal-directed, but not necessarily conscious.
Exactly.
So would you say that genes are like the architects? They lay down the blueprint for how the organism is going to be built.
That's a great way to put it. They build the hardware and the basic software, so to speak. They set the parameters, for how that survival machine is going to interact with its environment.
And that's how they maximize the chances of those genes being passed on.
Exactly. It's like they're setting up the operating system, but they're not writing every single application.
Okay, that's a great analogy. Now, this leads to a really interesting idea, which is how a selfish gene can actually lead to altruistic behavior. How does that work?
Yeah, that seems like a contradiction, right? But it makes sense when you realize that for a gene, self-interest can actually involve helping other individuals who are carrying copies of that same gene.
So it's like helping your relatives is actually a way of helping yourself from a genetic perspective.
Precisely. It's all about promoting the survival and reproduction of those shared genes. Dawkins uses this example of a hypothetical green-beard gene.
A green-beard gene.
Yeah, it's this idea that there could be a gene that, causes its bearer to have a green beard and also makes them act altruistically towards others with green beards.
So it's like a visual signal and a behavioral program all in one gene.
Exactly. But, in reality, that's probably pretty rare. It's more likely that genes recognize themselves in others through kinship.
Through family ties.
Right, because relatives are more likely to share the same genes.
So how do we measure this relatedness? Like how closely related are you to your parents, your siblings, your cousins, and so on?
Yeah, so you share about half your genes with each parent, right?
Right, because you get half your chromosomes from each parent.
Exactly. And on average, you share about half your genes with your siblings, too.
Because you're both getting a random mix of those same parental genes.
Right. And then, as you get to more distant relatives like cousins, the proportion of shared genes goes down.
So first cousins, how much do they share?
Well, they share 2 grandparents, so that works out to about 1/8 of their genes.
Okay, so the closer the relation, the more genes you share.
Exactly. And that means that the closer the relation, the more it makes sense from a gene's perspective to be altruistic towards that relative.
Because you're essentially helping to propagate your own genes by helping them.
Right. It's like you're making an investment in the future of your genes. And this is what we call kin selection.
Kin selection. So it's basically saying that altruism is more likely to evolve when the benefit to the recipient multiplied by their relatedness to you is greater than the cost to you.
Exactly. It's a cost-benefit analysis, but at the gene level.
So we're all unconsciously calculating these probabilities of shared genes when we're interacting with our families, or at least our genes are.
And in a way, yeah, natural selection has favored those organisms that behave in ways that, on average, maximize the survival and reproduction of their genes. And often, that means treating your kin better than strangers.
It's like we're all life insurance underwriters for our genes, investing in the relatives who are most likely to carry those same genes into the future.
That's a great way to think about it. And Dawkins brings up this fascinating point about the certainty of relatedness.
The certainty.
Yeah, like how sure you can be that you're related to someone. And it's not always symmetrical.
Mean,
Well, a mother is always certain that she's the mother of her child, right?
of course.
But a father, he can never be absolutely 100% sure.
Ah, I see.
And this difference in certainty can actually affect how much parents invest in their offspring.
So mothers might be more likely to invest heavily in childcare because they're more certain of their relatedness to their children.
Exactly. And this can even extend to grandparents.
Yeah.
A maternal grandmother, she's more certain of her relatedness to her grandchildren than a paternal grandmother is.
Because she knows her daughter is her daughter, but she can't be absolutely sure that her son is the father of those grandchildren.
Right. And these subtle differences can actually affect how much grandparents invest in their grandchildren.
Wow, that's fascinating. And this kind of leads to this idea of conflict within families, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Like the battle of the generations and the battle of the sexes.
Where genetic interests don't always align perfectly.
Right. So parents and offspring, they share 50% of their genes, but they might have different strategies for propagating those genes.
So a child might want more resources from its parents than the parents are willing to give.
Exactly. Because the parents have to balance the needs of their current offspring with their own future reproductive opportunities.
Right. They might want to have more children in the future.
And from the genes perspective, it's like genes in young bodies are competing with genes in parental bodies.
It's a tug of war between generations.
Yeah, exactly. And then you have the battle of the sexes, which comes from the different roles that males and females play in reproduction.
So it's not just about conflict between parents and children, but also conflict between males and females.
Right. Both sexes want to maximize their reproductive output, but they often have different strategies for doing so.
And this goes back to the asymmetry in gamete size.
Exactly. The egg is much larger and more costly to produce than the sperm.
So females are making a bigger initial investment in their offspring.
Right. And that can lead to differences in how choosy they are about mates and how much they invest in parental care.
So females might be more selective about mates, looking for males with good genes or resources,
Exactly. And they might be more likely to stick around and care for their offspring.
while males might be more likely to mate with as many females as possible and then move on.
Right. And Dawkins talks about this possibility of desertion by either parent and the cruel bind it creates for the parent who's left behind.
Because they've already invested a lot in their offspring, so they're more likely to keep investing, even if it's costly.
Exactly. And then there's things like courtship feeding, which can be seen as a way for males to signal their commitment to investing in offspring.
So the male brings the female food as a way of saying, hey, I'm a good provider, I'll help you raise our young.
Right. It's a way of reducing that initial investment disparity.
And then we get into sexual selection, which is a whole other fascinating area.
Yeah, sexual selection is all about those traits that might not necessarily help you survive, but they help you reproduce.
Like the peacock's tail.
Exactly. That huge flamboyant tail, it's a burden to carry around. It makes the peacock more vulnerable to predators.
But females love it.
Right. And that's because it's a signal of good genes. The idea is that a male who can survive despite carrying around such a handicap, he must be really fit.
So it's like a costly signal,
Yeah, and that's what Zahavi called the handicap principle.
the handicap principle.
Yeah.
So the costlier the signal, the more reliable it is as an indicator of quality.
Exactly. And this difference in reproductive strategies between males and females, it often leads to sexual dimorphism,
Which is,
the differences in appearance between males and females of a species.
so like males being larger and more brightly colored than females, or having antlers or tusks.
Right. Those are all examples of traits that have evolved through sexual selection.
Now, Dawkins also talks about cooperation, right?
He does. And he starts with this idea of the selfish herd, which is actually a form of cooperation that arises from individual self-interest.
How does that work?
So imagine a herd of animals that's being hunted by a predator. each individual animal wants to reduce its own risk of being caught.
Makes sense.
So they all try to get to the center of the herd where they're surrounded by other animals.
So they're less likely to be the one that gets picked off.
Exactly. And the result is a herd which looks like a coordinated group, but it's actually just a bunch of individuals acting selfishly.
Like a safety in numbers kind of thing.
Right.
And then there's reciprocal altruism, which is more like, I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine.
Exactly. And this can evolve in species where individuals interact repeatedly and can recognize each other.
So they can keep track of who's helped them in the past.
Right. And Dawkins uses the prisoner's dilemma to illustrate this.
The prisoner's dilemma.
It's a classic game theory scenario. You have two prisoners who are being interrogated separately, and each prisoner has a choice. They can either cooperate with the other prisoner by staying silent, or they can defect by betraying the other prisoner.
And the outcome depends on what both prisoners do.
Right. So if both prisoners cooperate, they both get a light sentence. If both defect, they both get a moderate sentence. But if one cooperates and the other defects, the defector gets off scot-free, while the cooperator gets a really harsh sentence.
So there's this temptation to defect, even though cooperation would be better for both prisoners in the long run.
Exactly. And that's the dilemma. And Dawkins talks about the strategy called tit for tat, which has been shown to be very successful in repeated prisoner's dilemma games.
How does that work?
It's simple. You start by cooperating, and then you just do whatever your opponent did on the previous round.
So if they cooperate, you cooperate.
Yeah.
If they defect, you defect.
Exactly. And it turns out that this is a really effective way to promote cooperation.
It's like you're rewarding cooperation and punishing defection.
Right. And Dawkins then goes on to apply this idea of replicators to culture with his concept of memes.
Memes. So like internet memes.
Well, sort of, but Dawkins coined the term meme back in 1976, long before the internet.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, and he used it to refer to any unit of cultural information that can be copied and transmitted from one person to another.
So ideas, beliefs, songs, fashions, those are all memes.
Exactly. They're all replicators, just like genes.
So memes are like the genes of culture.
That's a good way to think about it. And just like genes, memes compete for attention and resources.
So a catchy tune is more likely to spread than a boring one.
Right. And a compelling idea is more likely to be shared than a dull one.
So memes are subject to a kind of natural selection too.
Exactly. They're selected based on their ability to be copied, remembered, and transmitted.
And Dawkins gives examples like popular songs and religious beliefs.
Yeah, those are great examples. A song that's easy to remember and sing, it's more likely to spread.
It has high fecundity.
Exactly. And a religious belief that provides comfort and meaning, it can be passed down for generations.
It has high longevity.
Right. And both of these things, they contribute to the success of a meme.
So successful memes are the ones that can get themselves copied and spread.
Exactly. They're the ones that can thrive in the meme pool.
The meme pool. So that's like the cultural equivalent of the gene pool.
Right. It's the collection of all the memes that exist in a culture.
And just like genes, memes can sometimes come into conflict, right?
They can. Like Dawkins talks about the example of celibacy.
Celibacy.
Yeah. A gene that predisposes someone towards celibacy, it's not going to be very successful.
Basically won't get passed on.
Right. But a meme that promotes celibacy, like in a religious context, it can spread really effectively.
Even though it's working against the interests of the genes.
Exactly. It's like the meme is hijacking the survival machine for its own purposes.
That's fascinating. But Dawkins also points out the humans have this capacity for conscious thought, which gives us some level of control over these replicators.
That's right. We're not just slaves to our genes or our memes. We can make choices. We can set goals. We can think about the long-term consequences of our actions.
So we can transcend the dictates of pure selfishness, at least to some extent.
Exactly. And finally, Dawkins introduces this concept of the extended phenotype, which really broadens the scope of a gene's influence.
The extended phenotype, what is that?
It's the idea that a gene's effects aren't limited to the body of the organism that carries it.
So genes can have effects outside the body.
Exactly. They can influence the environment, the behavior of other organisms, all sorts of things.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. Think about a beaver building a dam. The beaver's genes are influencing its behavior, right?
Right.
But the dam itself, that's a structure in the environment, and it has a huge impact on the beaver's survival and reproduction.
So the dam is part of the beaver's extended phenotype.
Exactly. It's an extension of the beaver's genes out into the world.
That's a really cool way to think about it. And another example is parasites, right?
Yeah, some parasites can manipulate the behavior of their hosts in really amazing ways.
Like making them do things that are harmful to the host but beneficial to the parasite.
Exactly, and that manipulation, it's an extended phenotypic effect of the parasite's genes.
So the parasite's genes are controlling the host's behavior in a way.
Right. And this brings up the question of why genes bother to package themselves into individual organisms at all.
Yeah, why not just exist as free-floating genes?
Well, Dawkins argues that there are several advantages to this bundling.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, it allows for coordinated development.
Mm,
Like each generation, you start with a fresh slate, a new organism, and that allows the genes to build a new body from scratch according to their
this
instructions.
is like back to the drawing board each generation.
Exactly. And it also provides a kind of orderly timing cycle.
Uh,
Like an organism has a lifespan, a beginning, and an end. And that provides a framework for the genes to operate within.
so they know when to turn on and off, so to speak,
Right. And then there's cellular uniformity,
which is
the fact that all the cells in an organism have the same
right,
genes.
except for the gametes.
Right. And that allows for cooperation between cells.
They're all working from the same blueprint.
Exactly.
So the organism is like a temporary vehicle built by the genes for their own purposes.
Right. The genes are the real players in the evolutionary game.
And the organisms are just their temporary vessels.
Exactly.
Wow. This has been a really mind-expanding deep dive. So for our listener, who clearly has a sharp mind, what's the key takeaway here?
The big idea is that the gene as this fundamentally selfish replicator, it's at the heart of natural selection. And understanding this gene-centric view, it gives you this powerful framework for understanding the natural world.
It explains so much, from altruism to competition to the evolution of culture.
Exactly. It's a really profound way of looking at life.
So for you, our listener, who suggested this deep dive, we hope this exploration of the selfish gene has given you a really solid understanding of this incredibly important theory.
Absolutely. And as a final thought for you, our incredibly bright listener, think about how this concept of the gene as the fundamental unit of selection might change the way you view the world.
Yeah, how it might affect your understanding of everything from human behavior